The first letter of Peter in the New Testament begins like this: Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. It makes it clear that this letter was written to a group of churches in a region that we today call Asia Minor. Today, they are all parts of the country of Turkey. So it seems clear that this letter was written to some very particular Christians living in particular areas. But apart from that, we don't really know what they were dealing with. I mean, who were they? What were their struggles, their dreams, their aspirations? We don't know. Biblical scholars have argued a lot over this letter. When it was written and who actually wrote it. Many have actually expressed doubt that it could have been written by Peter himself. It is just written in Greek that is too good and with rhetoric that is far too well educated to imagine that it could have been written by a fisherman in Galilee. But whether this letter was written by Peter himself or by one of his disciples who sought to honor him, this letter was clearly written to Christians who were struggling, trying to figure out what it meant to follow Jesus Christ in their time and their place. And a big clue to the situation that they were dealing with is found in this cryptic phrase in the address, to the exiles of the dispersion. So whoever they were, they seem to have seen themselves as part of a dispersion, a group of people scattered far and wide. And that word that is used there is actually the same word as diaspora, a word that has long been associated with Jewish history. The long history of Jews living outside of the land of Israel, a history that actually began 2.5 millennia ago with the Babylonian exile, is often referred to as the Jewish diaspora. And many Jews to this very day still see themselves as part of this diaspora. So wherever these Christians were, they were Christians who had settled in parts of Asia Minor, but they didn't feel as if they belonged there. They came from somewhere else, someplace where they had put down roots, where they knew how to be the church. And then they had been spread far and wide to places where they just didn't feel as if they belonged. Now, perhaps that was because they had fled from persecution. Or maybe if they were Jews, and of course many early Christians were Jews, perhaps they were refugees from the war that had been fought between the Jews and the Romans in Judea between 66 and 70 AD. But however they came to be there, they recognized, and everyone else around them recognized, that they didn't belong. And they were trying to figure out how to be the church in a new place to which they had been spread. This letter was written to try and help them to figure that out. Christians in a dispersion or a diaspora. In many ways, wouldn't that be a really good term for the situation where we find ourselves as Christians today? I mean, we had it all figured out. We had settled down. We had put down our Christian roots in a certain place, in a building. We knew how to be the church in that place. Oh, we had practices and rituals and traditions that we had set in place that were so comforting and that had built us up in so many ways. And then what happened? Then suddenly everything changed. And we found ourselves dispersed to the winds, so that on a Sunday morning, when we would normally be gathered together, when we would normally greet one another in friendship and joy, clasping hands and sharing embraces, where are we now? We're in many places. Makes you wonder, when this letter was written and addressed to the exiles of the dispersion, is there not a sense in which it is directly addressed to us? We, like those Christians in Asia Minor, have the unenviable task of figuring out how to be the church of Jesus Christ in this unfamiliar place. And I cannot help but think that some of the advice given by the apostle to them might be helpful to us in the situation we are dealing with today. But of course, we didn't read the opening chapter of the letter this morning. Our reading was from the second chapter. So what particular advice for diaspora Christians like us might there be in the passage we read this morning? Well, Peter's first piece of advice, and I'm going to call the writer Peter for the sake of convenience, despite any scholarly doubts. Peter's first piece of advice for us is this: like newborn infants, long for pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation. Now think about that for a minute. If those words are addressed to people like us, I gotta ask, aren't they a little bit insulting? I mean, is not Peter here implying that we are newborn infants, that we are little babies and we can't even handle solid food? How can he say that to us, or even to the first century Christians in Asia Minor? We are not new to the Christian faith. But remember, he's addressing Christians who are in diaspora. Yes, we might have long experience being Christians in a certain place, in a certain context, but now we've been dispersed and we're in a new situation. And maybe the first thing we need to recognize is that we don't know how to be Christians in this new situation. Is that what the apostle is trying to teach us? Is he saying that it's time for us to go back to basics, to set aside any contentious theological debates and differences of opinions we had with other Christians, and just concentrate on being people who are willing to trust God to feed us? And by the way, since this is Mother's Day, I cannot help but make note of the metaphor that the apostle chooses to use. He says, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. Now he's quoting there from Psalm 34, a passage that speaks about God's gentle care for his people. It is a quote that we often use in the church. We often repeat it at the communion table, taste and see that the Lord is good. But I find it rather interesting that first Peter uses this verse just after telling us that we are all like newborn infants craving our mother's milk. Now, if we are infants, what then is it that we are tasting? Not wine, not food. We are tasting the sweetness of our mother's milk. God is breastfeeding us. So here is yet another time when the Bible actually speaks of God's care for us like a mother's care for her children. So it would seem that the first piece of advice that the apostle has for us in this Christian diaspora is that it's time to go back to basics, to learn again what it means to place our trust in God like babies in our mother's arms. But the letter also has more to say to us. One of the key problems that the Christians dispersed in Asia Minor had was that they didn't have any buildings. All the other faiths, all the other religions had these amazing buildings in first century Asia Minor. The temples of the pagan gods and religions of Pontus and Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia were legendary for their beauty and magnificence. But the Christians, they had none. I'm sure that bothered them. If they were dispersed Jewish Christians, and as I said, many early Christians were Jews, they might have also been feeling the devastation of the destruction of the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. It had been reduced to rubble by the Romans in 70 AD. So these Christians were struggling, trying to figure out how they were supposed to serve God without a building. Like most early Christians, they only would have met in private homes or maybe even in the open air. Well, we are definitely in the same boat when it comes like that. We were all troubled and surprised at our need all of a sudden to be the church together without a building. So I'm kind of interested what sort of advice the apostle might have for them. What's he going to tell them to do? Is he going to tell them to focus on getting into a building or institutional structure as soon as possible? Is he going to put into them the dream of being able to build a cathedral to rival these magnificent pagan temples of Asia Minor? Because honestly, that has been the program of the church since this letter was first written. As Christians have tried to build structures and buildings to rival the organizations and buildings of the non-Christian world. And I understand why Christians have done that. Because we've been taught that that's the kind of thing we need to do to be successful. But 1 Peter has a surprise for you if that's what you're expecting him to say. Instead of telling us to focus on getting into a building, he offers us this surprising invitation. Like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Instead of calling on these dispersed Christians to aspire to have religious buildings of their own, he says that they themselves are to be living stones, from which a new and very different kind of temple can be built. And I think that's a powerful message to Christians like us living in our situation. For one thing, it means that we don't need to compete with the glorious achievements of the pagan world in order to find honor and glory for the church. Now, that's not because the church can't do that. I think we all realize that Christian cathedrals in the Western world did come in time to eclipse the architecture of the ancient temples of Asia Minor. But you see, we didn't need to compete in that arena because the church is not meant to impress with buildings and structures of authority, but rather by Christians being living stones who live lives of authentic kindness and grace and do so in communion with others in such a way as to create a new structure made out of living stones. People see something like that, and they cannot help but give glory to God. But I think we've often missed the importance of that message in the church over the past 2,000 years. As I look back at the history of the church, what I see is a church that has tried to mimic the models of success that it sees in the world around it. And we've not only done that with our buildings, but with just about every aspect of our lives together. We've done it in structure and organization. Back in the Middle Ages, for example, when the model of success in society was found in hierarchy, the church built a structure that was all about hierarchy, bishops and archbishops and cardinals. Now today we live in a different world. And our world today has a tendency to define success differently. We define success as it is seen in the business world or the marketing world. And so what we tend to see is that churches who are able to mimic that kind of success are seen as being the great successes. So in many ways, we are still like those Christians dispersed in Asia Minor. We're looking around at these magnificent pagan buildings and aspiring to build something like them. But the apostle says that's all misguided. We have a different identity. We have a different definition of success. We are like living stones. And yes, he even suggests that as living stones, we might look like rejects as far as the world's concerned. We, like Jesus, are the stones the builders rejected and left dispersed around the work site. They didn't think they could build anything out of them. But that's because we are not made to impress in the way the world seeks to impress. But when we work together, and manage to support and uplift one another, we can build something truly amazing. No, it's not easy to be a people dispersed, ripped away from what is familiar and comforting. But I guess what 1 Peter is saying is, even if that's where we are right now, our God has not abandoned us and will be with us in this strange place. And if we're missing some sense of that presence of God with us right now, that's all right. These are unfamiliar times. But I think that if we follow the apostles' leadership, what we need to focus on is focus on going back to the basics, going back to the mother's milk that nourished us in our first faith. Let us learn to love Jesus all over again. And then let us be willing to be those living stones built into a new structure in this strange place, a new way of working together and supporting one another that maybe doesn't fit the models that we've been used to, that may not impress in the ways the world measures such things, but that creates a structure that God will use to do great things. Let's pray. We do feel dispersed and scattered, dear God. Help us use this time to go back to the basics, to taste again that mother's milk that nourished our faith at the first. And let us in our situations be those living stones in acts of kindness and generosity and love. Let us build something new, something at which the world will be amazed. Amen.